Hi, I'm Mr. Matt. I've been reading books to children for 25 years, and the book we're going to read today, Somebody Loves You, Mr. Hatch, by Eileen Spinelli, is one of my very favorites. I hope you enjoy it as well. Mr. Hatch was tall and thin, and he did not smile. Every morning at 6:30 sharp, he would leave his brick house and walk 8 blocks to the shoelace factory, where he worked. At lunchtime, he would sit alone in a corner, eat his cheese and mustard sandwich, and drink a cup of coffee. Sometimes he brought a prune for dessert. I love the details in this book. Take a look at the wallpaper at the shoelace factory. I don't know that I've seen that wallpaper before. After work, he would make 2 stops. At the newsstand to get the paper, and at the grocery store to buy a fresh turkey wing for his supper. After supper, he read the paper, took a shower, and went to bed early. He keeps to himself. That is what everyone said about Mr. Hatch. One thing that's interesting about this book, this little guy seems to appear in a lot of the pictures. See if you notice him or any of his friends. One Saturday, when Mr. Hatch stepped onto the porch with his dustpan and broom, he got a surprise. A package wrapped in brown paper. He'd never spoken to the postman before. "Thank you, Mr. Goober," he said. Mr. Goober smiled. "You're welcome. I always enjoy delivering packages." Mr. Hatch tore the brown paper off. Inside was a white box, which he opened to find another box. This one was heart-shaped, all satiny red, with a pink bow on top. It was filled with candy. Something fluttered to the porch floor. It was a little white card. He picked it up. It said, "Somebody loves you." Only then did he remember that this was Valentine's Day. Mr. Hatch wondered and wondered. Now who would send this to me? He was all alone. He had no friends. And yet someone had sent him a valentine. Who? He put the box on the coffee table and tried to do some dusting. But every time he left the room, he had to keep peeking to see if the box was still there. He dusted and dusted, and the dust cloth seemed to whisper, "Somebody loves you. Somebody loves you." At last, he flung the dust cloth away and exclaimed, "Why, I've got a secret admirer!" And then he did something he'd never done before. He laughed. He laughed and danced and clapped his hands. And then he took a piece of candy from the box and ate it. Mr. Hatch changed his shirt and found some old aftershave in the bottom drawer. He splashed it on his face. He picked out a yellow tie with blue polka dots on it and put it on. And then he went for a walk. Maybe, he thought, I will meet the person who sent me the candy. Of course, no one had ever seen Mr. Hatch wearing a tie, or smelling of aftershave, or smiling. So he got a lot of attention. Mrs. Weed tripped over her dog. Mr. Dunwoody nearly fell off his ladder, and little Tina Finn spilled all the toys out of her wagon. Mr. Hatch waved hello to them all. On Monday, it was back to work. At lunchtime, Mr. Hatch sat in the middle of the cafeteria. He spoke to everyone and passed out chocolates from his heart box. On the way home, as usual, he stopped at the newsstand. Mr. Smith handed him the usual paper. "I think I'll have a pack of mints," said Mr. Hatch, not as usual. Mr. Smith was shocked. "Was that you speaking, Mr. Hatch?" "Indeed it was," said Mr. Hatch. "I said I would also like a pack of mints. And if you don't mind my saying so, Mr. Smith, you don't look very well today." Mr. Smith recovered from his shock to reply, "You're right. I don't feel very well. I have a cold. I was supposed to go to the doctor's this afternoon, but the stand has been so busy, I haven't had the time." Mr. Hatch smiled. "Why, I'd be happy to watch the stand for you while you go." Mr. Smith could hardly believe his ears. "You would?" "Certainly. Just show me what to do." And so, Mr. Hatch ran the newsstand for an hour. He wondered if any of the women who stopped to buy a paper, or a magazine, or a candy bar had sent him the mysterious Valentine. When Mr. Smith returned, Mr. Hatch made his usual stop at the grocery store. "I'm a little tired of turkey wings," he told Mr. Todd. "I think I'll have a nice fresh slice of ham." Mr. Todd weighed the meat and wrapped it. "You look worried," said Mr. Hatch. "I am," said Mr. Todd. "My little girl is late. She hasn't come home from school yet, and I can't leave the store to look for her until my wife arrives." "Goodness! Why didn't you say so?" said Mr. Hatch. "I will go look for her." And so he walked to school and found little Melanie Todd by the swings and brought her home. Thank you, said the grocer. "Any time," said Mr. Hatch. After supper, Mr. Hatch did not bother to read the paper. He decided to bake brownies instead. It would be nice to have brownies to share the next day with the people at the shoelace factory. As he baked, the warm chocolate smell of brownies floated through the neighborhood. Children gathered round Mr. Hatch's house, sniffing the air. "Well, I suppose the factory can wait," said Mr. Hatch as he looked out the window, and he brought out 2 platefuls. "Now what are brownies without lemonade?" he said, and he stirred up a nice cold pitcher. When the parents came to gather their children, they had some brownies too. It turned out to be a picnic in Mr. Hatch's backyard. He dusted off an old harmonica and played songs he remembered from his boyhood. Everyone danced. And so, the days and weeks went by. When Mr. Hatch wasn't smiling, he was laughing. And when he wasn't laughing, he was helping someone. And when he wasn't helping someone, he was having a party in his yard or on his porch. He seemed to have forgotten about finding the person who sent him the valentine. Then one afternoon, Mr. Goober, the postman, came to his door. His face was very serious. "Come in, Mr. Goober," said Mr. Hatch. "You look upset." "I am upset," he said. "I made a mistake some time ago. My supervisor is very angry with me. Do you... Yes, Mr. Goober, what is it? Do you recall the package I delivered to you? On Valentine's Day, I think?" "Yes, I believe so," replied Mr. Hatch, beginning to feel a little uneasy. "I don't suppose you still have it," said Mr. Goober sadly. "As a matter of fact," said Mr. Hatch, "I still have the box. The candy's gone, though. Why do you ask?" The postman took a deep breath. "I'm afraid I delivered it to the wrong address. It was supposed to go to another house." Mr. Hatch recalled tearing off the brown paper It had never occurred to him to look at the address. He fetched the heart-shaped box and the pink bow and gave them to the postman. I do hope your supervisor won't be too angry with you now. The postman was heading down the sidewalk when Mr. Hatch called from his porch. Mr. Goober, I forgot something. He gave the postman the little white card that said, somebody loves you. Alone in his living room, Mr. Hatch sighed. Nobody loved me after all. Then he read the paper, took his shower, and went to bed early. The next morning at 6:30 sharp, Mr. Hatch left his brick house and walked 8 blocks to the shoelace factory. At lunchtime, he sat in the corner by himself, ate his cheese and mustard sandwich, and drank a cup of coffee. After work, he stopped at the newsstand for his paper, but he did not speak to Mr. Smith. And when he ordered his turkey wing from Mr. Todd, he did not smile. Nor did he pat little Melanie Todd on the head, or bake brownies, or have picnics or parties, or play his old harmonica anymore. Everyone whispered, "What is wrong with Mr. Hatch?" Mr. Goober, the postman, told them. "We love Mr. Hatch," insisted Mr. and Mrs. Dunwoody. "He gave us flowers for our garden. He helped to mend our back fence." Mrs. Weed nodded. "I love him too. He saved his bones for my dog, Ruffy." Ruffy barked, "Ruff!" She loved Mr. Hatch too. Mr. Smith told everyone how Mr. Hatch had watched his newsstand so he could visit the doctor. And Mr. Todd told everyone how Mr. Hatch had found his little girl. All the children in the neighborhood remembered Mr. Hatch's wonderful brownies and lemonade, and most of all, his laughter. "Poor Mr. Hatch," they said. "What can we do?" Then Mr. Goober announced, "I have an idea." On Saturday morning, Mr. Hatch woke to a bright and sunny day. He put on his old overalls and went out to the porch with his dustpan and broom. He couldn't believe his eyes. All over the porch were red and white hearts and pink bows. There were boxes of candy on the chairs and yellow streamers flowing from the ceiling. And sticking up out of his mailbox was a shining silver harmonica. The front yard was filled with people, happy, smiling people. They were holding up a huge sign with hand-painted letters. It said, "Everybody loves Mr. Hatch." Mr. Hatch dabbed a tear with his handkerchief. "I do believe," he sniffed, "somebody loves me after all." And then he smiled, and then he laughed, and then he hurried down to be with his friends. I hope you enjoyed it. One thing I love about this book for children of all ages really is that there's some important lessons embedded in the story. And for those of you who were listening, I think it might be fun for you to think about or perhaps discuss with your parents what you think the moral of this story is. A moral, in case you don't know, of a story, it usually means the lesson that we take from the story. You can pause this for a moment if you'd like to discuss it. One lesson that I take from this story that's very important to me is how much you can change a person's life by little things that you do. And so many people in this story change the lives of others. And it's interesting to me too to see how the effect of things that you do can be multiplied. Mr. Hatch got this box of candy, and regardless of who sent it to him, it had a huge effect on him. And then he, in turn, was in a much better mood and was in a position to be a much better friend to many other people. And each time that he helped another person, either by helping them watch their newsstand or look for their daughter or making brownies for someone, he increased his connections with other people and I'm sure improved their lives. And I think it's interesting to me to think about when you're a child, sometimes you feel like you can't have a big effect on the world. But I really don't think that's true. I think that as Mr. Hatch tells us, we all have the effect or the ability to have a big effect on the world just by doing nice things for other people. You know, another lesson that I take from the book, and this really has relevance to my own life, but it's interesting how different the same person's life can be when they make the decision to open themselves up to other people. Mr. Hatch, probably early in the story, felt like he didn't have much of a life. It was boring, he did the same thing every day, he didn't have any friends. But it didn't take a lot of difference for him to suddenly develop a lot of friends. I mean, really all he had to start doing was changing his attitude a bit and reaching out to other people. And I found in my own life, it's interesting because people usually feel like other people don't want them to be with them more than is really the case. In other words, what I'm saying is, I would sit in my chair and think, oh, nobody wants to talk with me. If I reach out and talk to somebody, they're going to think I'm silly or they're not going to want to talk. But as I got older, I came to realize that's usually not the case. If you approach somebody nicely and treat them well, they're going to welcome your friendship. And you will find that your life can open up and become much better than it was just by changing your attitude a little bit like Mr. Hatch did. So that, I think, is another very important lesson that this book teaches us.